Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us is the writer Shon Faye. She's the author of the Transgender Issue, Trans Justice is Justice for All. Shon, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
I want to start off with, well, more or less, well, let's, well, actually, and this is pretty basic, but let's start with the title, the trans issue. You wrote this as something of a little bit of a Trojan horse. Explain that for us.
Yeah, well, I kept hearing the phrase "the trans issue" both in the press in my own country, the UK, and also, you know, in American media too. And if you notice, when it's typically used, it's often used to sort of problematize trans people and to kind of erase the complexity. You know, I would be sat there listening to people saying the trans issue, and I'd be thinking, well, that, you mean me? That's my life at the most core level. And it's a way of abstracting, I think, the complexities of a minority, you know, the challenges facing a minority group, in order to make it seem like a conceptual problem for the rest of society, usually by the right. And so I wanted to kind of take that phrase back and say to people, when you hear this phrase, the transgender issue, you're not hearing about issues facing trans people. You're actually hearing about anxieties in society at large that trans people are perhaps provoking.
You mentioned the media in the UK and the just kind of all-out transphobic blitz that was happening and still is, but you know, here in the United States, viewing what was happening across the pond over in the UK when TERFs and that kind of ideology was just came to the fore, it really seemed like it was a trial run to do it here in the United States. And now we're seeing transphobia broadly being used to try to galvanize right-wingers to the polls and stir up hatred. What was that like, and how did that start, the transphobic media blitz? And I know that, you know, Rupert Murdoch's companies were involved in that as well. Here in the United States, it's the same deal.
Yeah, so I think it is frustrating. I think because there's a couple of cultural differences, obviously, between the UK and, for example, the US, in that here, for example, like Christian right objections to LGBT people do not have the same kind of perhaps appeal in the mainstream, like appeals to religious or moral reasons for opposing LGBT people and trans people specifically. But what I felt was happening here in the UK, in terms of what you described as the trial run thing, was here there was sort of a liberal respectability afforded to transphobia, usually under the guise of like superficially feminism, but quite quickly less of actual feminist argument and more kind of a paternalist reactionary claim to protect women and children, which actually can be a very right-wing form of rhetoric. And so I think what happened around sort of like, we've always had like issues with transphobia in the media in the UK, like pretty much since trans people have been around for about, you know, over half a century. But in the last like 10 to 5 years, as trans people started to become more visible, and there was a sort of peak visibility moment around the world, often led by the United States, and people like Laverne Cox and perhaps Caitlyn Jenner as well, her transition. The backlash in the UK started when we started to look at our gender recognition laws and potentially reforming them and looking at creating a kinder environment for trans people. Is quite quickly the Murdoch media that is very powerful, our tabloid media in this country, certainly traditional conservatives who just don't like LGBT people, and this kind of liberal, respectable transphobia that had persisted in our press kind of coalesced as an odd motley crew and started to, in earnest, campaign against some of the most like gentle reforms of the law that would help trans people, for example, identify their own gender legally.
I mean, it's interesting because I think that like it sort of feels to me that on some level it went, and I want to get to obviously other parts of this, but this is a worthwhile, I think, a topic, is that in this country, it became activated after there was marriage equality. and the Obama administration sent out a fairly, I think, a benign reminder to states that Title IX of our Civil Rights Act requires trans people to be able to use bathrooms based upon the way that they identify. And that became, I think, a rally cry for the right wing. And then it seemed to go to the UK and come back in that form that you talk about, that was appealing to sort of ostensibly liberals who who are concerned ultimately about feminism, they say, but it ends up, like you say, reiterating right-wing talking points. I want to get to that as you get into it a little bit later into the book. So we'll put a pin in that for a minute. But I want to also ask, and this again, now that we've gotten past just the title, the first line of your book, the liberation of trans people would improve the lives of everyone in our society. I mean, that is largely the theme, it seems, of your book, is that the trans liberation brings about a lot of material and, I guess, value to society writ large. Can you talk about that? Like, in what way?
Yeah, sure. So the idea is common to a lot of liberation politics. Like if you look at like early women's liberation movements like the suffragettes, a lot of Black feminist texts, they would say like, the liberation of women generally, the liberation of a Black woman, the liberation of gay people in early gay liberation. So yeah, I applied that to trans people, is that with any marginalized group in societies, a society is judged by how it treats the people at the margins, not the people like already near the glass ceiling. And so trans people being one of those groups, you judge a society by how they're treated. And the things that disenfranchise trans people, which is what I'm getting at there, are not primarily the things that are often people think they are in the media, like being misgendered, in your email signature or whatever, and the kind of finer points of workplace inclusion. It tends to be poor housing, community and family rejection, medical inequality and injustice, being forced out of legitimate economies into more dangerous economies like sex work. And so the remedies that need to kind of would be needed in order for huge numbers of trans people to lead more dignified and joyful lives would be things that would require radical social overhaul for everyone, because it requires, for example, a basic standard of living. It requires like housing and a social welfare safety net that is there for anyone for whom generational wealth, family support, community support, school support is just not going to be there. And of course, trans people are a group that slipped through the cracks in a late capitalist society that isn't consumed very much with supporting the most vulnerable members. And so I kind of try and say, like, yes, this book is about trans people, but also let's see if trans people are just a microcosm of wider social ills, rather than trans people being the social ill, as the right frame us to be.
And why? I mean, is it that trans folk are almost like the canaries in the coal mine in terms of, or at least representative of, or their issue sets, the material issue sets that they face are just a function of the most politically marginalized in society? I mean, is that ultimately why addressing those material needs for trans people would end up addressing the material needs for a much broader part of society?
Yeah, they are, because, I mean, they're not the only canary in the coal mine. There are plenty of groups and different trans people will have different experiences because of, other components of how they're politicized, though, like along the lines of race or class, for example. But I think broadly, yes, it would be fair to say that like trans people, especially in the time we're living in, are kind of a canary in the coal mine. Like, even if you look at like the question of medical inequality and trans people's bodily autonomy, I think with regards to what has happened with Roe versus Wade, I think it's very clear that when you start to have arguments based on curbing a minority group's bodily autonomy on the basis that it's somehow immoral, or it's like playing with things that shouldn't be played with, or it's not people's destiny, or that gender should be a certain way, it's not very long until that splits both into homophobia and to misogyny. And I think it's very clear to see the connection in the US, for example, between the attack on trans people and the attack on women generally. And then I think with regards to gender itself being such a powerfully organizing principle of how we structure our society, of course, in many ways, like people think of bathrooms and so on, but right down to like our system of incarceration, the fact that trans people's very existence threatens this. You can either see trans people as like a bug in this sort of system, or you can start to wonder whether or not they're actually exposing a flaw in the system as a whole. And so, for example, with regards to mass incarceration, the problems where you look at like how do we accommodate trans people within the present system of incarceration, the liberal response that someone like, I don't know, Kamala Harris might espouse. The problem there is that actually you're looking for a more humane option in a system that's fundamentally inhumane. So I'm interested in using trans people to expose the inhumanity in wider systems of oppression and discrimination.
Well, let's and I want to get to that too, actually, because the arguments you hear. I mean, I am most interested in the arguments that we hear from that, sort of quasi-liberal set that we have imported in some ways from England, because the religious fundamentalists, it seems to me, their critique or their complaints, I guess, about the existence of trans people is, in many respects, it seems to me, almost identical to what it was with the existence of gay people, frankly. But it's a far more ostensibly nuanced critique that I think I want to get to. But let's talk about, like, you in the same way that you say the answer for that question of how do we, accommodate trans people in prisons is also the issue for sex work. Walk us through that and why sex work ends up being one of those, I guess, silos where addressing the issues for trans people is really one that we need to address for everybody.
Okay, well, for example, with sex work, the reason that, in my book, I devote a whole chapter to sex work. The reason being is that globally, sex work is the largest, trans people are mostly occupied in sex work if you look at a global scale. And even, I think, whether you look in the US or, like when I looked in my own social circle in London, certainly amongst trans women, some participation in sex work was probably more common. It was more common to have done some kind of sex work than to not have. And the reason being for that, so there's two things going on there. Is one, why is sex work so potentially, I want to say appealing, but perhaps like the choice that some trans workers will choose to enter into? It's probably because of disenfranchisement from the so-called illicit economy, from other forms of work, where you're likely to encounter all sorts of discrimination. There can be lots of positives in terms of, freedom from discrimination and other benefits to sex work for some trans sex workers, even though sex work can also be very dangerous. And particularly then, the marginalization of sex workers and trans people are intertwined, one, because there's this overlap in the two groups, but also, that like sex work becomes unsafe because of how we as societies choose to criminalize it, punish it, push it to the margins to make sex workers participate in more and more unsafe working practices. And I think it's a shame that both leftist and feminist analysis often lose sight of the fact that sex workers both are workers and majoritively are women, and that the response there should be looking at their rights in terms of right to work in safety, rather than necessarily looking in a sort of moralistic way about the rights and wrongs of sex work and the people that buy sex, the men that typically buy sex.
So in terms of the kind of the pipeline that is created here, it's a lack of broad acceptance of trans people in society that perhaps pushes them maybe into other industries where, or something like sex work, where perhaps they're able to be openly trans, but that it also, I would imagine, does not lead to broader societal acceptance and is more of a fetishization as opposed to like a something that's more liberatory.
Yeah, I mean, completely, I agree. Like, look, it's a case of like, if you look at like I guess the classic example would be, you know, for example, say a young trans woman, perhaps who doesn't have like strong family ties or family support. You know, it's also the fact that one, you're struggling in the mainstream employment market, if you want to call it that, to get a job at all, and, you know, potentially on where you live, like what rights you might have in that employment, and the discrimination you may face by colleagues, customers, whoever, combined with the fact that like healthcare is so expensive, whether we're talking the US or the UK, like that's not accessible to many people. And you're looking at potentially trying to fund healthcare that includes hormones, maybe surgeries to change your body. And that sort of stacks up, and suddenly like sex work, for example, can become quite appealing in terms of being able to access financial resources, you know, more quickly and in it being a lesser of many evils in terms of the workplace. And then, but then combined with that too, yeah, is the fact that like obviously that does not necessarily lead to greater like social acceptance, and it is often participating in, you know, all the problems that accompany the sex industry, both for the workers and how they're treated, but also, yeah, I guess in terms of how that is, yeah, you're obviously marketing something that can be fetishistic or, yeah. And I guess trans sex workers will have a sort of wide range of feelings about that. But the problem is that like all of these arguments around sex work, for example, is that if people are uncomfortable with the negative aspects of sex work as an occupation for trans women, trans people, or cisgender women, the answer is like, well, why are people doing sex work? It's because of lack of welfare, lack of financial resources. So if you really, and often, you know, if you look, I suppose the other aspect there is immigration, and the fact that we, you know, undocumented workers will often be more likely to turn to sex work. So really, it's our immigration system and our poor welfare system in many countries around the world that are responsible for people choosing sex work. And so if you don't like the fact that people are in sex work, it's probably better the choice comes from giving them more resources, I would argue.
You also you have a chapter on the state's role in the issues that face transgender people. Talk a little bit about Section 28. I mean, this is obviously British unique, I guess, English unique, but what role did that play in creating issues, I guess?
Yes, I'll just quickly explain. So Section 28 is a law that was passed in the UK, and it, you know, stands for the Local Government Act that section was in, and it was an act about local, like government maintained schools, like, you know, what you would call in the US public schools. And all public schools from 1988 to 2003 were not allowed to promote homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. That's what the legislation said. I was born in 1988, so someone like me, I'm 34 years old, like pretty much the entire time I was at school, Section 28 was in force. It meant that teachers could not teach positive things about LGBT people. LGBT teachers, gay teachers could not be out as LGBT at school. If you were being bullied, your teachers were worried about comforting you about it. School libraries could not have books that were positive about LGBT people. It was kind of like an omerta about queer trans identity, full stop, period. And the impact of that, of course, is, as someone that like grew up through that, is that obviously for those young people growing up LGBT at that time, it probably had a really deleterious effect on mental health and personal well-being, because you're coming into a consciousness at school or whatever, and your peers are as well, that you might, have this very, ultimately a minority identity. And the message you're getting is that like actually it's secretive, it's something to be secretive about and it's shameful. For teachers, of course, it like encouraged homophobia amongst teaching faculty. Many teachers received, who will have qualified, teaching staff who were qualified during the era of Section 28 are still teaching now, and they all picked up all sorts of ideas and never really had them challenged because it didn't form part of their teacher training. So its legacy kind of lived on for quite a long time, I think. And what's distressing, that campaigners in the UK spent a long time campaigning to repeal that law, and it took a long time. What's distressing now is that you see rumours in the UK with our current Conservative government is that there are campaigners campaigning to basically re-implement that law. They know it's no longer palatable for lesbian, gay and bisexual people, but there are campaigners very vociferously campaigning for British schools to not be allowed to teach anything positive about gender ideology, gender identity, which I would say is code for trans people. I don't really believe there's such a thing as gender ideology. That's the existence of trans people.
We should say that I think for a lot of people who hear this, we have a don't say gay law in Florida that is being replicated around the country. And I think that's very much the sort of the similar dynamic. And it's set up in such a way that it is vague enough, and the repercussions of transgressing that law is substantial enough that it begins to self-censor. And that's just at the beginning. And like you say, after a decade or two of living under that regime, it begins to have like a sort of a feedback loop, and you start to see it reflected, I imagine, in teachers and a whole host of other sort of like issues that it creates for kids who have to go through that. But let's talk about this question of trans ideology and move into this question of like the way that there are two forms, I feel like, of transphobia, or it presents itself in this country anyways right now. Yeah. One is the sort of that religious fundamentalism where they don't want any type of divergence from the sort of classic patriarchal roles and hierarchy to be in any way altered. But then there's also this other sort of like burgeoning industry, it feels like, of worrying about a growing movement of trans or gender ideology that is bringing about sort of like these vague problems. The problems, and as I hear them articulated, trans women in women prisons, and what they're doing to kids. It's like there's predation and indoctrination, and then also castration or and all of these things. And let's walk through these. Now, I know you've addressed the prison thing in saying that the solution is to get rid of the carceral state in many respects. But what is how do you respond to it in the event that that's not happening, right? I mean, that's obviously like a radical change. Like, what is the addressing here? Because when I have engaged with people that they can point to a story or two that they saw where there is a rape that has taken place in a women's prison by a trans woman, but they forget about the problem of prison rape, but writ large, both for women and for trans women. So how do we address that issue? And then let's go through some of these, or even calling it. I mean, I don't know if it's an issue because we don't have real data on this, but it is a complaint or it's an argument.
Yeah, well, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because the thing is that if someone is enacting kind of violent crimes or predatory crimes, the reality is that like in an ideal sort of like system, in a prison system, it should be the vulnerable people are protected from predators. And that doesn't matter whether the predator is like a cis man, a trans woman, a cis woman. it shouldn't matter. But the reality is that what is, this is a criticism of the prison system. I just have to say this, is that obviously you can have, the prison system is a complex thing where we put together people who can be both abuser and abused, people who, people who have not committed violent crime with people who have committed, violent crime. And so prison is inherently an unsafe place, and I think, I'm never going to argue that vulnerable people should be put at risk by a trans prisoner. That's not what I believe. It's not the right thing. What I'm interested in, I think, is how that instances of where that can happen, and that can happen, is used rhetorically to make broad sweeping policies around a group for whom the prison experience itself, and we're talking particularly about trans women, trans people generally, but trans women, is extremely brutal, is extremely violent. And usually, certainly in my country, that has been used, these sort of hard cases have been used to make broader arguments about self-identification of gender, depathologizing the process by which you change your legal sex generally for everyone, whether inside prison or outside prison, because it's this idea that if we allow me to change my my gender without a psychiatrist report, essentially, then that poses a risk in prisons. The reality in the UK, for example, is that actually trans prisoners who want to move from the women's estate to the men's estate and vice versa, there is a process that they go through, and that process is supposed to vet them and look at their offending patterns, for example. That has clearly failed in certain cases, because I described them in the book. There was a case of that happening. So that sounds to me like institutional failure, as there often is in terms of prison governance, whether, not a failing of, the trans movement and what it's asking for in terms of depathologizing the process by which we are recognized by the state, if that makes sense.
Yes, the existence of trans people in prison in no way has any significant bearing on the pre-existing problems that exist in prison. And if we're going to, we need to address the pre-existing problems that exist with prison, is really the only way to address any of these sort of subcategory problems, because they're really not subcategory problems. They're problems with prison. It seems to me. Well, yeah. I mean, I was just going to say that, I'm not, and I don't mean this as a cheap gotcha, you don't care about male guards, but male guards are, there are plenty of instances, I'm sure, in the US and definitely in the UK, of for example, cis male prison staff having inappropriate relationships with female prisoners, for example. And I'm not saying, you can't care about both things, but there is no vociferous campaign I have seen. Something I've seen 20 to 40%. 20 to 40% of women in prison are, and obviously it happens to cis men in all male prisons as well. But yeah, it is sort of shocking to me that there is this level of concern about the potential for trans cis rape as opposed to cis rape, which is very well documented.
I mean, the contradiction's obvious. I just also want to point out another piece of hypocrisy, which is bodily autonomy for one's decision not to get vaccinated or not. But when it comes to one taking their healthcare into their own hands and choosing to transition, that is something that the state needs to get involved in.
Right. Well, let's talk about some of the other sort of headline rhetorical, I guess, issues, and that is. We've talked ad nauseum to the question of sports here, but let's talk specifically about puberty blockers and surgeries. We had a situation where somebody in custody now for calling in a bomb threat to one of the most I think, renowned children's hospitals in the country that provides pediatric health care. They also provide health care for children who are trans, or who may are questioning whether they should transition or to slow down puberty or whatever it is. What do you make of this angle, I guess, in, that both this is the predation on children, and children, and I guess ostensibly their parents, don't have the ability to determine what kind of healthcare they need?
Yeah, well, the protection of children and women and children, more paternalistically, but let's say children, the protection of children has always been one of the most powerfully anti-queer, anti-LGBTQ forms, rhetorical tools for hugely reactionary and usually quite systemically violent responses to LGBT people. Why? Because everyone who considers themselves a decent person wants to protect children. It's a very easy rallying emotive cry that would tap at most people, into most people's sense of morality. However, where it becomes skewed is that is that when it comes to conservatives, the protection of children tends to be framed as, we are protecting children from an ideology, a group that is spreading a social contagion, predatory gay adults, trans adults who are trying to recruit them. Whereas the reality is all the evidence shows, right, is that the biggest risk to LGBT kids comes from bigoted adults, to their mental well-being, to their safety, whether it's their parents, whether it's their teachers. And so this idea of the protection of children is one that people can have very different ideas, and they can be talking about that and mean very different things. And with regards to trans young people and trans children, I think we're in the state of what I think is a moral panic. And I talk about moral panic theory in the book. Very similar to, for example, the satanic panic or other scares amongst about young people. Because the disproportionate focus on the treatment of a very small number of trans young people whose gender dysphoria is so acute that they feel distressed by the development of their secondary sex characteristics in puberty, that it's worth it, for them suppressing it. That will not even be all trans young people. Some trans young people don't feel that level of distress, and a lot of trans people will only come to the realization they're trans long after their puberty is really begun or even finished. So this is a very small number of people. In the UK, where obviously we've had quite a big moral panic about this, I say there are 12 million children in England, where I live, 12 million children, and under 16, 95 of those children were on puberty blockers at the time I wrote the book in 2019, 95 out of 12 million. And the disproportionate levels of media coverage that this got. I think the other thing that's worth saying, right, is that a lot of these treatments, so for example, puberty blockers, that have become so apparently controversial, puberty blockers were developed for cisgender children who usually for precocious puberty. The precocious puberty is a natural variation where puberty occurs younger than the child's peers, and for reasons of alleviation of psychological distress, feeling self-conscious, puberty will be temporarily slowed down or paused. And that was how it was used since the 1970s. And it's only since the 90s, anywhere in the world, it's been used on trans young people. And so for me, I find it quite startling that there's moral panic has arisen about potentially whether or not doctors are competent to prescribe this, whether or not young people are competent to, or their parents on their behalf are competent to give consent to the treatment, when in fact this has been a treatment that's been used since the 1970s. So, coming up 50 years on cisgender young people. And it shows to me a kind of double standard, that when we look at trans healthcare, it tends to be, both for children and for adults, sensationalized, trans people's agency is immediately removed, and it's problematized because it seemed to be about gender. It's not seemed to be about real healthcare. And that's where I see the link, you know, with abortion, is that I think in the US, you can probably see now that probably there was a liberal consensus for a while that every woman has a right to an abortion. And it's been quite jarring around the world to see that the growth of the belief that that is not the case, that every woman has a right to autonomy of her body in that way, but that there clearly has been a working, growing and politically potent movement seen to curbing that idea and that principle. Yeah, to me, they seem like it seems inherently linked, that this is about, as I said earlier, bodily autonomy, and about the fact that like we are able to do what we want with our own bodies under a patriarchal system, that you should not be compelled to participate in gender with your body in any way that you don't want to. And that the arguments that it's natural or, you know, ordained by God, or, you know, that you're messing around with hormones, or that you're messing around with, you know, bodily integrity, these are like misogynist. They've always been misogynistic, and they are also deeply transphobic and harmful arguments. And yeah, I think the other thing to say with kids is that I think there's been a lot of anxieties that have been stoked. So, for example, a lot of, in the UK, we have some like gay and lesbian adults who are very gender non-conforming. For example, you know, there might be butch women or very femme gay men, for example, who remember being very gender non-conforming children and are of the belief that they would have been quote unquote trans now, had they grown up now, that there is a kind of conveyor belt for any gender non-conforming child into medical transition. I feel that that is like ludicrous. I felt like when I often was speaking about it in the UK, I had to treat it with a bit more sincerity. But, you know, it's worth saying it's a ludicrous notion that the idea that you are, certainly in the UK, and I imagine it's like the same in most states in the US, that you are suddenly whisked off and given all of these drugs and surgeries the minute that you like do something a bit gender non-conforming, like play with a doll if you're a boy, or climb a tree in dungarees if you're a girl. It's just nonsense. Like most parents do, you know, are not prepared, even when they do have a trans child, for a trans child. And I can say personally that as someone that like, you know, was misconstrued as potentially a feminine gay boy when I was like an adolescent, people were very keen that I like really try and stick with that and not transition. And I think it's fair to say that that's the general rule of where society is with the acceptance of trans people. And I don't know any trans person that believes that you can't be a cisgender person and very gender non-conforming. Like trans people I know at least tend to be, you know, there might be some with very conservative ideas about gender, obviously, because we're a diverse group, but most of us accept, like, you know, I have gay male friends who wear dresses. Do you know what I mean? I don't think a man in a dress needs to transition. Well, you're doing a poor job of pushing the trans agenda in that instance. So.
Well, listen, it's fascinating stuff. Can't recommend the book highly enough. We will put a link to the transgender issue. Trans justice is justice for all. Shon Faye, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about it. Hope to talk to you again soon about more of these things, because I think this is, as a rhetorical bludgeon and an electoral device, at least in this country, it is not going away. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.